Hello, I'm Dominic Davies, founder of Pink Therapy. We've been training mental health specialists worldwide to work with gender, sex, and relationship diverse clients for many years. This podcast puts the lives of some of these incredible, pioneering therapists front and center and gives us insights into what it's like to be LGBTIQA+, or as we prefer, GSRD, speaking in their words.
Welcome, Erene. I'm delighted that you're joining us for this podcast. And I'm really open to seeing the kind of conversations that we have. So why don't you tell us your name and pronouns and a little bit about where you're living and working?
Yeah, of course. And thank you for having me as well. My name is Erene Hadjiioannou. My pronouns are she, her. I'm based in Leeds. Professionally, I'm in my private practice, which is called Therapy Leads. So within that, I provide psychotherapy, training, consultancy, various writing and speaking engagements. I would also call myself an activist as well, which I guess we'll get into maybe a little bit more in the podcast. I obviously work with a lot of queer clients in my work, and my area of focus is trauma as a result of sexual violence. And more often these days, I'm finding that those two things are very much kind of meeting. So there is definitely a real kind of need from queer people, from someone who is kind of supportive of the diversity of queer people, as well as understanding of actually what does trauma kind of look like and what's its impact, particularly if you're a queer person.
Yeah, I remember some years ago hearing Laura Brown, a lesbian psychologist, talking about trauma and internalized homophobia and transphobia and the like. And she was basically saying that this is all trauma, actually, and it's not post-trauma. We are living in pervasive, continuous trauma. There isn't an escape. It doesn't end, and then we can kind of heal. It's like, how do we learn to live with the constant trauma? And I think we're starting to really recognize trauma as being a core process within our queer lives. I don't know what you would say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And actually, one thing that I've written and spoken about before is kind of, as therapists, how do we find the person amongst the trauma? Because I found in my work, yes, of course, we, traditionally might talk about like symptom alleviation. So how do we help people process nightmares, flashbacks, manage depression and anxiety, live daily lives in a meaningful way, but actually who are they as they're going about the world and doing that? And you're right, particularly for queer folks who may, far more likely than sort of cis-het folks to be kind of marginalised and oppressed. How do they navigate regular everyday life when there's marginalisation and oppression before, sometimes during and after, say, sexual violence? So it's kind of coming at you from all angles, and how do we all carry that around and be who we are and have our lives, really? Yeah,
that's right. What are you working on in particular at the moment in terms of research or projects? What's taking up some of your time?
Well, I had a book come out last year, which is actually on this particular topic. So it's called Psychotherapy with Survivors of Sexual Violence Inside and Outside the Room, right. Which is exciting. It's my first book.
Congrats.
And thank you. And it was specifically written from a gender inclusive perspective, which I know that the discourse around sexual violence has been very kind of binaried. Statistically, cis-het women are affected, but we do know cis-het men are affected. We know all different kinds of people are affected. So there's been a lot of work off the back of that in terms of, say, conferences and other bits of writing. I'm also actually with a fellow Pink Therapy student. We've submitted a paper to the European Journal of Counselling and Psychotherapy on queer minds, queer needs. So trying to support therapists to better welcome queer clients and the diversity and the fluidity of what that might mean into the room. So hopefully that gets published. It's being peer reviewed at the moment, so we're really excited about that.
Oh, that's really good. I didn't even know about this. Secret projects. This is fantastic. Fantastic. Oh, wonderful. And I mean, in terms of sexual violence, I went to the launch of a report from the Coral Project a few years ago when that research first came out, and I was really stunned how they were saying that the queer sexual violence, intimate partner violence, what runs on a very different lines to our previous thinking around feminist perspectives on violence and intimate partner violence. And I thought that was very interesting. Identifying a perpetrator. Who is the perpetrator? If you've got two gay men going at each other. And that kind of fitted my experience of friends who might be engaging in that from time to time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I've actually just read a paper which was based on the Coral Project, which I found really interesting. And one of the sections actually, which I thought was super helpful, was it mentioned love practices, which I found really helpful to actually bring to life something which I think dispels a lot of the myths around kind of sexual and domestic violence that makes people really struggle to understand just how anyone can be affected. And what they meant by love practices was just, what do we exchange in our relationship that, within a healthy relationship is all very well and good, i.e., we're going out for dinner and I'll pay, that can seem, generous and absolutely fine. But if we're talking about controlling abusive behaviours in the context of domestic violence, is it we're going out for dinner, you don't have the finances to pay for it because I control them, I'm going to tell you what to eat, and then we're going to go straight home. So I think what people really struggle with sort of understanding sexual and domestic violence is actually how is it interwoven into a relationship. So you're right, who is a quote unquote typical perpetrator or a victim, or what behavior is abusive. So yeah, we really have to dispel all those myths in what we do, I think.
And how is it experienced by the person who's being taken out for dinner? Because I can think of in many DS contexts, it would be perfectly normal for the dominant to take the submissive out for dinner, choose their food for them, and it be part of their protocol, but they wouldn't be feeling that they were being negatively controlled in that sense. They would feel safe, and I don't have to make the decisions, and somebody's taking care of me, and so it's very much about a cultural perspective on it, and how does it get experienced by both parties? Does it feel coercive, or does it feel consensual and liberating in a way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I completely agree with that. And I think, there's all these different layers to it, which so easily gets lost if we get stuck in that really dominant societal narrative of, domestic violence looks like this, and this is who a perpetrator is, and this is who a victim is, and that's it. And as therapists, I think that's extremely problematic because, how do we help people if we can't even recognize what's happening, or all of those important questions?
Yes, you're right. There's so many layers, aren't there? If you haven't had any training and understanding certain sections of the communities, then it's like it's going to be heard very much through a particular lens or ear, and that may well not be the case at all, and you're making all kinds of assumptions then. Yeah, interesting. Okay, what's life like for GSRD folk where you live? What's life like in Leeds, would you say?
Leeds has got a pretty vibrant queer scene, I would say. We've got our own kind of gay quarter on Briggate. Lots of like bars, clubs, if you like all those sorts of things. There's like a queer bookshop that's relatively new. we've obviously got kind of Pride up here as well, which is super fun. So definitely lots of things that people can get involved with. So yeah, I think if you're wanting to connect with a community, there's definitely opportunities. Even things like there's like a queer hiking club if, you know, sort of going out drinking isn't really your scene, which is great. There's a really, really great initiative called Leeds Freedom Families, and they're also linked. They're under the same organisation as something called Leeds Freedom Angels. So the Freedom Angels kind of go out sort of in the evening in the gay quarter to sort of help people out if they're sort of kind of struggling with something, or, you know, maybe had too much to drink, just to be supportive, make sure they're okay. But the Freedom Families initiative is kind of what it sounds like. It's for queer families in Leeds. So there's definitely pockets of things happening in good ways, I would say.
And so interesting community responses to taking care of each other, and they sound both really valuable initiatives. Yeah. How? I mean, I live in Brighton, and I think in Brighton, with such a big queer community, I feel relatively safe holding my partner's hand in public, and those kind of public displays of affection. In most areas of Brighton, I would feel okay. I wouldn't, when I came from London before, I would have said I was more selective about certain streets. It felt okay, and other places it didn't. What's your view of things in Leeds? Do we see many same-sex PDAs, or is that something that doesn't really happen too much?
In Leeds, it's definitely on my radar, but I mean, that's like the way that I am, so I'm going to notice it. So, but also I think I'm very aware of, I guess this is where intersectionality comes up, and it's one thing I hear a lot, I guess from various people in my personal professional networks, and also clients, that idea of, you know, I'm, for example, you know, somebody who is queer and neurodivergent and a person of colour, finding that actually there's rarely spaces where all of those things are kind of explicitly welcomed and accommodated for, and things like that. So it's, you know, whilst Leeds has got a lot going on, there's, you know, of course, unfortunately, people that still feel like there's not quite the right spaces for them, or they're struggling to consistently get what they need, which is such a huge part, unfortunately, of the queer narrative over the decades, really. And, you know, I guess in this day and age, especially having just come out of, you know, the lockdowns and the pandemic, actually people's need to have those encounters in person rather than just online, to kind of really be welcomed, celebrated, feel safe, feel happy, you know, make the connections they want to make.
Yeah. Okay. And what would you say are some of the current challenges facing your clients in terms of managing their identity and living in their social context? What do you think they're wrestling with?
I think the political situation at the moment, particularly around trans people, obviously comes into the room when I do the work that I do. So anybody who is trans or non-binary, I think particularly people that are seeking sort of hormones and surgery to affirm their gender, and just knowing how difficult that is, particularly if you can't afford to do that privately. There's obviously been everything on sort of conversion therapy at the moment, and the absolute, I don't know, U-turn on the whole thing is the most diplomatic way I can say it. But it really does come into the room.
So does Leeds have where do trans clients in Leeds go if they want to access medical intervention?
We do have a gender identity clinic for, I believe it's children and adults, which is part of the Tavistock sort of collection of clinics. So that is available, but of course waiting lists are really huge.
I was wondering, do you know how long they are?
I checked recently, and it was this is vague, but I don't want to say the wrong figure, but yeah, a couple of years essentially, which, you know, time makes all the difference.
For sure.
And I've definitely found it in my work that I think some clients have, when you say that you're sort of queer affirmative, LGBT plus friendly, then people assume that you may be able to sort of do the assessment for them to give them the green light for medication and things like that. And unfortunately, being a psychotherapist, that's not part of our role here in the UK. But I've definitely found that, I mean, I don't believe in gatekeeping at all. So if I'm aware of any resources, I do just hand them straight over, because it's so lacking and confusing. And the healthcare system on that side of things is so inconsistent and scarce that, you know, we as therapists, I think, just have to step up and do what we can in that capacity, really.
Yeah, for sure. It is very much a controlled access to treatment in the UK, in the hands of certain types of psychologists, even rather than even more general psychologists. I was listening to Iggy Moon talking about their research into gender psychologists working in gender clinics, and how you really have to be on a particular list now to get to be doing it. And even if it's your first day in the job, you can make those decisions, but you might be fresh out of training and not have had any much experience. Whereas other people who might have been working with trans clients for decades and really get to know the client very well are deemed unsuitable or inexperienced at being able to help the client decide whether that's the right thing for them. And my previous guest was talking about working in a clinic in a university in New Zealand, which is working on an informed consent model. And so clients can come in and talk about what they want, and they're affirmed in their gender identity rather than being suspicious, and they're supported to in their decision making, really, rather than questioned in it.
Yeah, because I mean, unfortunately, the binary turns up everywhere. So I mean, you'll know really well in the work that you do that, you know, if somebody, for example, wants top surgery, they tend to feel pressured to present more masculine or male in order, no matter what their gender identity is, in order to sort of get the green light. Which is hugely problematic and I think quite often distressing for clients. And I think actually to link what we're talking about to a part of the Pink Therapy course that I've obviously just done is that idea of expanding on like gender dysphoria as not necessarily a like distress-based experience, you know, i.e. if somebody does want hormones or surgery, do they have to necessarily be distressed? Because I've certainly met clients that don't fit that criteria and would seek those routes really to explore even and affirm their gender, which there's a lot of barriers in the way really for people to just be themselves, which is a huge issue, I think.
Yeah. You also mentioned a few moments ago the kind of being therapy being a political resource, and I wondered if you wanted to say a bit more about that, because I think when I'll just preamble it for the listeners. When Silva Neves and I were writing the new chapter for the SAGE Handbook of Counselling and Psychotherapy, where GSRD therapy got elevated into the modalities, alongside Jungian and CBT and systemic, suddenly we were asked, put your model there, rather than working with special populations, e.g. LGBT, which it was at the beginning, you know, four editions ago. I kind of thought, well, what is the modality? If it is a modality of its own, what is it? And I think it's rooted in social justice. I think that's the first stance. We stand on the shoulders of feminists and of cross-cultural therapists, you know, Black psychology, and it is actually a fundamental start that we're about social justice. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally with you. One thing that I've said for a long time in a lot of different contexts is that psychotherapy is basically useless if the only work we do as psychotherapists is in appointments. Firstly, because we exist in a largely inaccessible mental health system. And I mean, I work in private practice. So obviously by default, people need to be able to afford to pay to sit in front of someone like me. I've also worked in the third sector, the NHS. I've also set up and managed services in the third sector. So I've literally managed waiting lists, and it's, there's something very, I think there's something, as an experience for me, very problematic and stressful about holding that much power in how long people have to wait, whilst also, I guess, systemically being disempowered, because if you have a very small team and not really much funding, then you can't meet demand, which is obviously a classic issue in the mental health system. So essentially wherever people go, it's a bit of a gamble as to whether or not they're actually going to get what they need. So, and I think particularly for queer clients that face kind of marginalisation and oppression in regular everyday life, which, you know, causes mental sort of distress, psychological distress, then actually if all we're doing is I guess teaching people how to be more resilient or to understand themselves better, manage their mental health better, etc. And then we both go back into a world where all the oppressions exist, and actually kind of what's the point really is my stance. So I try to kind of introduce kind of like activism in my work as much as I can, really.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you had suggestions, because I think some therapists find it hard to believe or understand or get their heads around, well, what else could I be doing other than just sitting with my client and working with them on their issues? What might be some of the other roles or activities that therapists could be doing?
I think we have to appear in our community in multiple spaces to not only make sort of therapeutic support more accessible, but I think also to kind of work with members of our community to try to facilitate spaces, forms of support that actually, would be helpful, because often I think services are created, and while there can be service user input, that I think there's still kind of that issue of, perpetuating the sort of inherent power imbalance of psychotherapy. If we say, hey, we're here and this is what we've got, so, try and get an appointment, really. So I kind of talk about going into stepping out of the rooms that we work in to kind of bridge the gap to sort of making services accessible. So, for example, I've done kind of workshops in my community. I've done sort of guest presentations in existing sort of support groups, just to provide psychoeducation and sort of practical techniques, usually around trauma, because that's my area of focus. But I think also kind of advocating for and with our clients as much as we can. I think even in our field, so an example for me is a long-standing piece of work I've been involved with is the issues caused by the Crown Prosecution Service guidelines on pretrial therapy. So a lot of that's just kind of raising awareness even within my field and just the general public as to actually the issues those guidelines cause in practice. So essentially just kind of shouting a lot in a lot of different places to make people aware and hopefully create some change. It doesn't have to be doing more therapeutic work. There's lots of ways we can do those things.
So trying to change things at a systemic level is one, and then also working within community groups to offer workshops and support outside of a therapy one-to-one room, which kind of can do psychoeducation and provide support and discussions and things like that. Yeah,
it's getting on the ground with people. Because it's I don't know if you've ever had this thought process, but I've been thinking recently about how like therapy can just be this kind of mystical, nebulous thing, and actually that's super unhelpful. In practice, but also just in terms of it should be just applicable to regular everyday life. It shouldn't be about the therapist holding all the knowledge and the power and imparting wisdom. It's actually about who are you, what do you need, and how can we work together. And sometimes I think that does mean being on the ground with our communities and, getting outside of appointments really.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree. Tell me what you're passionate about. What gets you excited or really engaged? What do you love?
I think just finding joy in connecting with like-minded people. I think particularly, it's partly why I sort of jumped at the chance to have this conversation with you, because I think as a field, like you say, we've got very problematic legacies that we are. That we find ourselves sort of really trying to untangle to do really good work. So actually, when I do connect with other people that seem to be on the same wavelength, I do find a lot of joy in that. So yeah, and I think just generally queerness is great, and we should have more of it. So that's my humble opinion.
Yay for queerness! Yeah. Anything else?
How do you relax? How do I relax? I was going to say, if we're talking about what I like kind of personally, I guess this will tell you something about me. I'm finding more ways to relax in terms of going slowly, but I'm a very active person. So do a lot of weight training and all those sorts of things. I just like moving. I have friends and colleagues that really like things like dance, and I'm just not that way inclined. My body doesn't really move in that way. But yeah, things like weight training and kind of moving in other ways, I just really love it. So yeah, that's what I do.
Great. What motivated you to undertake our program, and what might have been the most interesting parts for you in doing so? You've just coming to the end of the foundation year. So what?
Yeah. There isn't a course like it available. And I qualified in 2014, 2015, so a good while ago. And there was definitely a module on, I guess, what they would call diversity, but yeah, barely scratched the surface, I would say, which is unfortunately pretty typical of training courses from what I'm hearing, although things are definitely improving, which is great. And I've just worked with more and more queer clients over the years. And I guess going back to that point about how difficult it is for people to access the healthcare that they need at the time that they need it. So for me, there's a responsibility there that if somebody does quote unquote find me or we end up sitting in front of each other, then actually I've got a huge responsibility to kind of like do it right. And I think particularly because when I work with queer clients, more often than not, they're the ones that sort of arrive and say, actually, I had a really bad experience with therapy before, or this part of my identity was pathologized or ignored, or I had the sense it wasn't safe enough for me to talk about it. So for me, it's just about kind of doing better, really.
Yeah, that experience of therapeutic disruptions or encounter the encounter being broken in some way by therapists being misattuned and not knowing how to work with that or recover that, I think is an issue, particularly because of our clients are often very hypervigilant to being pathologized and coming from a traumatized place. They're spotting the nuances of any kind of challenge from a pathologizing kind of perspective.
And one thing that I hear a lot from clients is kind of wanting somebody, basically the idea that sessions are always led by them, and I'm very much, I'm your ally, and I do mean that in the queer sense as well. We've really got to stand with each other. And I mean, the way I describe my working style is that I do share what I think, and I do share resources, and I am very proactive. And I think I think that's helpful because I think silence can be very anxiety inducing for a lot of clients for a lot of different reasons, particularly if, you've gone through life and that's led to a necessity for hypervigilance. So actually, if I'm sat across from you saying, actually, this is on my mind, and does that make sense? Does that have any resonance? Can we play around with that? I think it's not only something that kind of hopefully offsets that kind of hypervigilance, but also is me really actually stepping up to what I'm here to offer. Also, I can't really imagine turning up to work and not saying anything. So I think that would be a very boring job.
Well, I mean, some people take the stance that the client needs to figure it all out for themselves and they'll get there in the end. And that feels to me to be really taking a very powerful position, that they're withholding their knowledge rather than being collaborative and co-creating knowledge and the relationship and stuff.
Yeah, and I've found in my work, particularly with queer clients, and I would say actually particularly people that have said, I chose you specifically because you're, you're very experienced in this, is that idea of like role modeling, like actually, how do we have a conversation as two adults? How do we share information? I might have my own lived experiences. I'm obviously very careful about disclosure because it has to be therapeutic and appropriate. But in terms of like other resources and signposting, etc., and combined with the person's lived experiences and what do they need actually? How do we combine those two things?
And psychoeducation and all of that is again part of the model, I think. So how has the course changed your practice, if anything? Have you noticed any changes in the way in which you're working in this last year?
Yeah, I've been, I found it's given a definite shape and language where there might not have been some before. And I would, I really like the concept of inviting in rather than coming out, which I think has been really great for clients with intersectional identities. And that idea of we're not necessarily having silence forced upon us, i.e. we're not being forced to stay closeted. We're actually using to employ silence at times of our choosing in ways that suit us. Because I think for a lot of clients with intersectional identities, it's, that idea of we'll just be out and be yourself can mean, not having a family. That's as important as, being queer for a lot of people. Absolutely. So actually, how do we manage that really, how do we manage that nuance really sensitively? And I think actually it's more of I think for some clients, it's a much more empowering way to think about kind of being yourself in an open way. So I really like that.
Yeah, I think it's a really helpful concept too, that you choose to invite in certain people, but it's not open knowledge to everybody in the world. They don't deserve that knowledge about you until you choose, and unless you choose to tell them. And so that you've got your safety network, you've got your people on your side, and that might be family or certain members of family, but it's also might be that it's not safe for you, physically safe for you to share that with everybody in your community or within your family.
Yeah. It makes me think of, I guess, the political element. Again, that idea of one thing I've been toying with in my mind for a while and have explored with various colleagues, and I think some clients, is the idea of who we are as public property. And I think that's such a huge part of, the trans narrative at the moment. And, trans bodies and trans identities are being colonized really and villainized and pathologized. And there's so many different types of queer identity or even just other parts of who we are that, is primarily it should be just for us. What's my connection to myself? And I think when it gets ripped apart by homophobia, transphobia, either in a private or a public sphere for whatever reason, then people don't even have the like the privilege of their own relationship with themselves in an enjoyable way, in a comfortable way. So I have just had that on my mind a lot as I've been doing this work. I think, and again, really highlights for me how much of this work is really political.
It's very much so. I'm constantly learning, 40 years of doing it, and I'm still finding new things out all the time. So recommend me a book or a film.
Okay. I've literally taken one off my bookshelf, and it is called Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl, and it's by Andrea Lawler. It's a fiction book. It's really cool because the main character can literally change their body at will, and has lots of different social, sexual encounters, and just I think it's a really cool way to explore.
It's an exciting concept,
like gender is very fluid, and actually how that changes how the main character experiences themselves, but also how other people experience them. And I just really enjoyed it, so I'm recommending it to everybody.
Oh, that sounds lovely. Thank you. And my final question is, because I'm a fairy, I'm going to give you 3 wishes. What would you wish for?
I'm going to go down the political route to start with, I'm afraid. And I think it would be improving.
Don't be afraid of it. Embrace it.
I know, but I think I know that like I know in this forum it's well received, so I appreciate it. So I think the first thing is really just we need to revolutionize trans healthcare. The system doesn't work.
It's completely broken. Yeah.
It's broken, and it doesn't actually leave a lot of room for exploring the fluidity of gender, because we do, like I said earlier, we do seem to keep falling into those binaries. It's an extremely distressing process, not least because of the weight. And I would also like to my second wish is to meet more kind of therapists that have that activist streak in them, and that real sense of social responsibility. I know you're out there, and I think there's pockets of us, but we would be so powerful if we could all find each other and do things. And that it's definitely happening, but yes, more please. Third wish, honestly, I currently have COVID and I'd like it to go now, please. So that's my third wish.
Not to have COVID anymore. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I'm 2 weeks after clearing it, and I'm not better yet. I can still feel my energy levels really
It's
low.
The fatigue. Yeah.
And a friend said to me, it took him 9 months to feel like he got his body back. And I thought, oh no, I really hope that's not going to be my journey. But yeah, it is the fatigue, isn't it?
Yeah, I know people with long COVID, and it's I feel immensely for them. So yes, I get it.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining me. I've enjoyed our conversation.
Me too.
And good luck with writing up your final essay.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. Cheers now. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please click like and subscribe to hear when the next one is released. If you're a therapist looking to enhance your knowledge and skills with GSRD clients, please check out our training website, pinktherapy.org. We run 1 and 2 year specialist training programs online, as well as offer a wide range of short CPD modules. Thanks again for listening to On Becoming a GSRD Therapist.